Now we'd like to invite our second speaker of the day, Satnam Baines. Satnam is the father of 3 children and lives in the Birmingham region. His background is mainly in technology, having worked in this sector for over 20 years, and he has a specific focus on digital healthcare.
Great. So thank you to the organisers for inviting me down today. Like when I was sitting there and listening to Dr. Wasmer, I was nodding my head furiously because we've been lucky enough to have Dr. Wasmer to take care of our daughter, who I'm going to talk about today. So many of the things that she was talking about, I could relate to. And I was thinking, yeah, you know, actually that's true. At the beginning, it was like this, and towards the middle, it was like that. And I think you'll see some of that in my presentation today. So I'm just going to quickly go through that, if I can get it to work. Okay, fantastic. So when I was putting this presentation together as a father, I was trying to understand, well, what is the focus of the topic? How do I best get across the experiences of somebody who's managed a child with encephalitis? So to give you a bit of background, my daughter, who had encephalitis, had an autoimmune version of the disease, and she had it when she was around about 18 months. I may get some of this information wrong. My wife's sitting in the audience somewhere. She'll probably put her hand up and start shouting at me if I get it wrong. But I'll try and recollect all the things I can do in the best way possible. So I think she was around about 18 months. So, and to give you some context, she turned 16 last week. So we celebrated her 16th birthday. So what I intend to do is to give you my insights of the overall journey of how we've sort of managed that whole process. And in terms of how to do that, what I really wanted to do is focus on the areas of concern. And you know, everybody's got a different way of looking at these things. But the way that I looked at it is that but being from a sort of technology and methodical background, I tried to categorize every element of her development and upbringing. So these are the areas that I'll talk about today. So the first area is all about health and how we managed her health, going from the acute phase to where we are currently today. And I think some of that is in line with what Dr. Wasmer's already talked about. I talk about the healthcare system, which I always say that, you know, we have to work really hard in managing rather than so just simply attending appointments. I'll talk a little bit about education and schooling, the social side of things. Mental health is a really important aspect, especially in the current climate with COVID and everything else. I'd like to talk about sort of some of the cognitive observations, and then I'll sort of end up talking about the family side of it and the what I think the future holds for us. So from a health management perspective, so I can't see the slides, so I'm trying to sort of look back all the time. So from a health perspective, I think there's a recognition, and Dr. Watson's already talked about this, is that the when we went into hospital, we were in the acute phase of everything, and it's pretty horrendous for every parent to sort of watch this happen to their child, because you see a seemingly healthy child deteriorate rapidly. And in our case, like we saw abnormal movements, we saw seizures, and it progressively got worse to the point where our child lost the use of her sight, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, and from having a healthy child to having someone suffer all of these things in front of you and then being sent home with all of those ailments is something that I wouldn't wish upon anyone, but it does need to be managed. So you try and do the best to manage that situation. And I think, you know, what happens is that in our circumstance, when our daughter was ill, she was fitted with a gastronic tube, so there was a lot of learning for us in terms of how to manage that gastronic tube, how to sort of understand how to feed her, how to use the specialised equipment, but also to sort of, I think I talked about this, also try and understand how we worked with the NHS as well, because there's a numerous amount of teams that we had to work with. And I think, that although over the years we've been quite lucky in that we've seen a really good improvement in our daughter. She's now at school, and if you spoke to her, you wouldn't actually think there was much wrong with her, unless you got into an argument with her. Then you definitely see a different side of her altogether. But then, I think the thing is that we constantly remain vigilant, and we know she has real issues. She has real cognitive issues as well, but that's an ongoing thing that we have to manage. So this is the slide. I was getting confused about the two slides. So in terms of working with the NHS, it is like what you tend to find is that from when you're in the acute environment, everything's managed for you. You've got fantastic doctors, you've got fantastic nurses, you've got people who are perhaps giving you the information that you need. You're getting everything that you could possibly want. You've got machines monitoring your children, and you feel that you're under the right level of care. And suddenly you're sent home, and you're in the wilderness essentially, because then you find that there's an army of professionals that you have to work with. So there's physiotherapists, there's speech therapists, there's people from the community trust, there's your GP, there's your pharmacists, there's the social workers. And what you tend to do is that you're having to repeat yourself again and again and again. You're talking about the same thing, and you're trying to put in context what they can do to support your child in the context of their profession. And that takes, from a parent's perspective, it's frustrating, and it takes a lot of energy. And there is a lot of disparity in terms of performance of these different teams. So some will be really good and some will not be so good. And then you also have to hold your nerve a little bit as well. And I think this hasn't changed, I don't think. No, I think some of this is still true today, in that the system is still fragmented. And but what I think sincerely is you have to, everybody has the best intent at heart. Everybody wants to sort of do the best for your child. So you have to be a little bit patient in terms of doing that little bit of work with them. So if you take that, what I found works for myself and my wife is that if you work with them in partnership and tolerate that sort of repeating yourself, you probably get a better outcome. And then if you also take responsibility of some of the coordination yourself as well, and sort of preempt some of the problems before they happen, you'll probably get a better outcome. But if you sort of sit back and sort of think, well, the system will sort itself out, you'll have a bad outcome. So I think those are the key learnings that I have. And we're still in that environment now. It's not something that I could say happened a while ago. That's very much the case today. And I think the last point, it feels like ongoing project management. So the next aspect is education. From a personal point of view, as I say, when my daughter first fell ill, she was a child, and now she's a young adult. And when and there's part of you, irrespective of what doctors tell you, thinking that actually everything will be okay. By next year, everything will be fine. So when she was 5, I was thinking, by when she's 8 years, she'll be fine. Or when she's 10, thinking, when she's 13, she'll be like any other 13-year-old. But it's at some point it dawns upon you that's not the case. There always is going to be disparity in terms of learning, education. And even now, standing in front of you, I find that very difficult to accept. I find it very difficult to accept that my daughter is not going to be on the same level of the same parity as her peers. I think it always gets very difficult because you're always hoping for the best, and then suddenly you get to that goalpost when you recognise that may not be the case. So I think where we are now, especially over the last few years, is that we acknowledge that your child could still have a very good life, but it's a very good life in the way that is suited for her or him. So it has to be in the context of that individual. So I always say to my daughter, well, if you end up being a baker, then bake the best cake you possibly can. Yeah. Or if you want to be a school assistant, be the best school assistant you possibly can. But it's entirely up to you what you want to do. And I think that's the learning for ourselves, is that don't have any preconceived notions about education and educational achievement. It's whatever the individual can excel at. And it's part of our role to make sure that we support them in that role. And so there's also something around social interactions. Like what I found was that, and we're still finding this, is that when your child's 4 or 5 years old, whether it's a girl or a boy, they're cute and cuddly, aren't they? Like everyone's, what did everyone takes an interest. But what you actually don't realise at the time is that there's a form of emotional equity, I call it, in terms of people give you a lot of space. Like they give your daughters a lot of space to make mistakes. They're very patient with them. As they get older, that patience wears thin. So when you've got a 5-year-old with learning difficulties and you have another 5-year-old, what tends to happen is that the other 5-year-old will be quite patient with that 5-year-old. When you get a 15-year-old sitting with another 15-year-old who's constantly, and the other 15-year-old is constantly obsessed with Instagram or whatever the thing is, sometimes your child can't relate to that. So as I think sometimes as we get older, it gets more difficult because you have the social impact of everything else. I'm going to try and rush through some of these things because we've only got a few minutes left. Mental health is a big aspect as well. We're all in really difficult times at the moment with COVID, and I think we found over the last year not having those social interactions, being stuck at home, I think everybody who's in the same situation as us it's very difficult because we're almost forgotten in this sort of COVID climate, where it's okay to sort of state that we're all safe at home, but the mental issues that people have by not being able to go out, not being able to mingle, is very difficult with children with special needs. They need that social interaction, and I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And there's a couple of points on there. Is that what we tend to do is to try and look at. We almost have to do a mental or emotional health check on children, on our child, because what we found is that if they're quiet, if they're withdrawn, there's something wrong, and then that's something that we have to look out for. Cognition is another area like that I'm interested in. I've already touched upon the point that the people that will best know your child, and Dr. Wassmer alluded to this, is ourselves or the teachers. If there's a change in behaviour or a change in ability, so for example, you suddenly find that your child can't perhaps understand things quite as well, or there's a learning difficulty that wasn't there, we need to act upon it because there might be a relapse of the autoimmune condition itself. And family is a very important part of everything as well. Like we over the years couldn't have gone through what we went through without the support of family and friends. And that's not just for the practical things of everyday life in terms of dropping children off at school, getting care, getting support, but also from an emotional support perspective, going out and having a change of scene every now and again. So in terms of the future, what does the future hold? And I think, again, I go back to Dr. Wassmer's presentation, is that there isn't an end, actually. There's only the ongoing vigilance and the work that needs to happen. So it continues to be a collective effort with family and friends and doctors. We need to work across all areas. The COVID situation does make things a little bit more difficult. It makes us a bit more vigilant. But even simple things like getting access to healthcare professionals isn't as easy as it was before. And really understanding mental health and looking at the future in terms of skills and sort of what does the future hold in terms of career aspirations, relationships, and supporting your child for that. So I think I did sort of rush it towards the end, but I think that's the end of the presentation.